9 ships turned around, and Washington called that proof the blockade was working. That is the kind of number that sounds impressive on television and means almost nothing once you understand the waterway. Roughly 2,000 ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz in a normal month. The channel narrows to about 21 miles. One side is geography, the other side is policy. American officials can move carriers, bomb runways, tighten sanctions, and threaten escalation. Iran still sits on the northern edge of the choke point. China spent a decade preparing for the day that fact would matter more than all the talking points. That is the real story. The real story is not that Hormuz became dangerous. Hormuz has always been dangerous. The real story is that a decade of Chinese planning turned Iranian vulnerability into a strategic asset at exactly the moment. America tried to squeeze it into surrender. That is why this should not be described as a misunderstanding or an accident or a temporary crisis created by one round of bombing. What you are watching is the collision between two very different ways of thinking about power. Washington still thinks in the language of direct force. It looks at the board and sees carriers, bombers, sanctions, pressure packages, escalation ladders, and public threats. It assumes that if one side is stronger in the visible instruments of power, that side can eventually force the political outcome it wants. Beijing thinks differently. It thinks in layers, it thinks in timelines, it thinks in conditions. China does not need to fight the war itself. China only needs to build the economic, financial, logistical, and diplomatic environment that keeps its chosen partner from collapsing when pressure arrives. If the partner does not collapse, then the stronger military power does not get the clean outcome it expected. If that happens at the world's most important energy choke point, the meaning goes far beyond one war. That is what Hormuz has become. Before you decide whether America is winning or Iran is winning, ask the harder question: what does each side actually need? America does not just want de-escalation. America wants demonstration. It wants to prove that when it decides a strategic waterway must be open, the waterway opens on American terms. It wants to prove that sanctions still isolate, that military pressure still compels, that an aircraft carrier still means what it used to mean. This is not only about Iran. It is about every capital watching from a distance and asking whether American course of power still has the old authority. Iran does not simply want relief from pressure. Iran wants relevance turned into structure. Iran wants every state that depends on Hormuz to understand that Iran is not a country to be bypassed, but a country whose geography must be managed, negotiated. And in the best case for Tehran, quietly respected a state under sanctions becomes much harder to isolate if it can make itself indispensable to the movement of global energy. Those goals do not fit together. America cannot prove it controls the strategic outcome if Iran keeps demonstrating that geography still gives Tehran a veto. Iran cannot turn Hormuz into a permanent source of leverage if America can force unconditional compliance whenever it wishes. So this was never a misunderstanding waiting to be cleaned up by one diplomatic meeting. It was always a structural fight over who gets to define the meaning of passage through the most consequential waterway on the planet. Now bring China into the frame. The easiest mistake in this story is to imagine China as a dramatic wartime ally preparing to rush in with destroyers and flags and speeches. That is not how China works here. China's role is colder than and more consequential. China built what I would call Iran-esque survival architecture. That architecture has several layers. The first layer is financial. American sanctions are designed around the power of the dollar system. If a country cannot clear payments, cannot reach banks, cannot safely sell exports, and cannot recycle revenue into imports, that country begins to suffocate. China spent years helping Iran avoid that suffocation by building channels that did not depend on dollar clearing in the first place. Oil purchased in yuan is not just a commercial detail, it is a strategic decision. It means the pressure tool was anticipated before the pressure was applied. The second layer is shipping for years. Analysts tracked what became known as the shadow fleet, the dark fleet, the ships that went quiet, the paperwork that changed, the cargoes that became someone else, as crude by the time they reached port on official paper. Some barrels stopped being Iranian long before they stopped earning money for Iran. That is not a loophole. That is an ecosystem. And ecosystems matter more than headlines when a war begins. The third layer is reserves. China did not enter this period exposed and improvising. It entered with time stored in tanks. Strategic petroleum reserves are not just about oil. They are about patience. They allow a state to absorb shocks that were supposed to create panic. If one side arrives at a crisis with stored patience and the other side arrives hoping markets will do the coercive work for it, the side with time already owns part of the board. The fourth layer is diplomatic shielding. China does not need to loudly bless every Iranian move to matter. A veto, a delayed resolution, a call for restraint, a refusal to internationalize Washington as preferred narrative. All of that changes the operating environment. The point is not that China publicly takes over Iran's case. The point is that China helps prevent the emergence of a clean, globally legitimated mechanism for forcing Iran into total submission. Put those layers together, and the result is not Iranian comfort. Iran is not comfortable. It has taken enormous damage. Its economy has been hit. Its military infrastructure has been degraded. Its ruling system has been forced into a level of stress that would break many states. But stress is not the same thing as collapse, and that is the distinction Washington keeps missing. America's theory of pressure depends on a bridge between pain and surrender. China spent years making that bridge much harder to cross. So Iran can be battered and still keep agency. Iran can be squeezed and still decide when to open, when to close, when to bargain, and which symbolic terms matter. That is why the story cannot be told honestly as a simple tale of American leverage grinding its way toward inevitable success. If you want the cleanest way to see the logic, look at the options available to Iran and ask why none of them ends with Tehran voluntarily giving up the Hormuz card forever. Option 1 is surrender the point of leverage and accept that America has established the precedent. That would mean admitting that the one geographic asset that makes Iran structurally important can be neutralized by punishment. No serious state chooses that unless it has already been broken. Option 2 is escalate blindly and try to turn Hormuz into a permanent battlefield. That sounds strong in rhetoric and weak in practice. It invites a larger coalition, deeper economic damage, and the risk that Gulf states, which prefer distance from the war, are pushed into actively supporting the anti-Iran front. Option 3 is the path Iran keeps trying to create, to preserve the fact of Iranian relevance without accepting the language of defeat. Open selectively, close selectively, link passage to diplomatic conditions, tie maritime movement to wider negotiations, turn what Washington wants to frame as law enforcement into a negotiation over terms. That is the game. And China's decade of preparation is what made option 3 sustainable. This is why so much mainstream analysis feels thin. It looks at visible force and invisible resilience and gives almost all the weight to the force because that is what can be filmed. Carrier decks can be filmed, bunker busters can be filmed, press conferences can be filmed. Financial plumbing cannot, reserve strategy cannot, long logistics chains cannot, political patience cannot. But in contests like this, the invisible structure often decides whether the visible force produces a final result. There is a historical echo here that matters. Think about Suez in 1956. Britain and France could operate militarily. They could seize ground. They could generate headlines that looked like success. What they could not do was escape the larger financial and geopolitical structure closing around them. Their problem was not the absence of military capacity in the narrow sense. Their problem was that the foundation under the operation was weaker than they believed. Hormuz carries a similar lesson, though not an identical one. America has more military power than Iran by any normal measure. That is not a serious question. The serious question is whether military superiority by itself can still force political outcomes when an adversary has been embedded inside a Chinese-supported architecture designed to absorb exactly this kind of pressure. If the answer is no, then the lesson of Hormuz is larger than Iran. It becomes a case study in the limits of 21st century coercion against states that sit inside alternative systems of trade, payment, energy storage, and diplomatic cover. Now notice the second tree in the story, the China tree. China does not have a clean option either. It can confront the United States directly, which would be strategically reckless in a theater where Washington is already concentrated and where Beijing does not want a naval collision. It can abandon Iran, which would destroy years of investment and prove to every partner that Chinese support expires the moment risk becomes real. Or it can do what it has been doing. Stay just below the threshold of direct war while preserving Iran's economic oxygen and quietly demonstrating that American pressure no longer operates in a vacuum. That third path is the most Chinese path available. It is slower, less cinematic, harder to narrate. And because it is harder to narrate, it is also easier to underestimate. But it is exactly the kind of path that changes systems over time. Look closely at the monetary angle because it may turn out to be one of the most durable consequences of this entire episode. When movement through a global energy artery becomes entangled with yuan settlement, even partially, even irregularly, even in ways still hidden inside layered shipping practices. The lesson is not that the dollar system has collapsed. That would be crude and false. The lesson is that its monopoly character is being contested in places where contest used to seem impossible. That matters because America, as sanctions architecture, relies on more than laws and naval capacity. It relies on the assumption that the rest of the world ultimately has no serious alternative when Washington decides to weaponize financial centrality. China does not need to completely replace that system tomorrow. It only needs to build enough partial alternatives in enough strategic corridors that pressure stops producing decisive political outcomes. Hormuz is one of the places where that theory has now been tested in public. And notice what that means for every government in the global south, for every sanctioned state, for every middle power trying to reduce its exposure to the dollar system without openly breaking from it. They are not only watching whether Iran survives, they are watching how it survives, they are watching which structures held, which channels stayed open, which partners proved useful, which kinds of pressure created pain but not surrender. That is how strategic learning works. One crisis becomes a template for 10 future calculations. This is why the phrase Iran would never give up Hormuz should not be heard as emotional bravado. It is better understood as a structural statement. Iran would never give up Hormuz because Hormuz is not just a bargaining chip. It is the mechanism through which Iran converts geography into relevance. And China spent 10 years making sure that if Tehran ever had to defend that mechanism under maximum pressure, it would not be doing so while economically suffocating in total isolation. No airstrike changes geography. No press conference changes geography. No sanctions package changes geography. The northern shore of Hormuz is still where it was before the war. What changed was the strategic environment around that fact. China helped build an environment in which geography could be monetized, defended politically, and folded into a wider contest over payments, sanctions, and global order. So when people say, why does Tehran just give it up? The real answer is that from Tehran's point of view, giving it up would mean giving up the one card that survived decades of sanctions, decades of pressure, and now a direct phase of military confrontation. States do not voluntarily abandon the card that keeps them relevant, especially when a great power has spent years quietly making that card more playable. That brings us to the real closing question. What exactly has America discovered here? Not that Iran is stronger than America. It is not. Not that China is ready to replace the United States everywhere overnight. It is not. What America has discovered is something more precise and more unsettling. It has discovered that overwhelming visible power can run into invisible structures that were built slowly, patiently, and specifically to prevent exactly the outcome Washington wants. It has discovered that sanctions are not omnipotent once alternative payment and shipping systems mature. It has discovered that military superiority is not the same as strategic finality, and has discovered all of this in a place where 1/5 of the world, as oil, reminds every market, every state, and every strategist that geography still has a vote. That is why this moment matters. Because the most important thing happening in Hormuz is not the latest ship movement or the latest televised claim of success. The most important thing is that a decade of quiet planning has become visible. The architecture that used to sit in the background has stepped into the foreground. Everyone can see it now. And once the hidden structure becomes visible, the world starts asking a much bigger question. If China spent 10 years making sure Iran would not have to surrender the Hormuz card on American terms, what other cards has China already spent 10 years preparing to protect somewhere else? That is the question that survives after the headlines fade. The lesson of Hormuz is not that one day changed history. The lesson is that history had been prepared for years, and most people only noticed when the toll booth lit up